Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. If you haven't been keeping up to date with the Speaker's Corner scene recently, well, young Bob went to Speaker's Corner and debated a Muslim gentleman named Tay. And one of the arguments that he brought up is an argument from divine simplicity, which St. Thomas Aquinas has actually used in his corpus of writings.
I was simply establishing that his Allah has passive potency, that his Allah moves to a state, to imperfection, to perfection. Your Allah is powerful by the virtue of the part of the attribute of being powerful, which means there is a state of potentiality between his attribute and his essence, which means there's a passive potency. Passive potency directly implies imperfection.
And I would actually like to help break down this argument in today's video to help you guys come to terms and grips with the argument and maybe help a few people in using it. So, firstly, before I get into the actual syllogism of this argument, I'd like to lay out some definitions so that people don't get completely lost if you are extremely unfamiliar with this metaphysics stuff, right? So let's lay out some core definitions. Definition number one is just going to be act, and act is just a perfection, what is fully real, finished, or fulfilling, an actuality, something thought of as influencing potency in some way. It's a determining principle. It is basically the intrinsic principle which confers a definite perfection on a being, hence a form. So let's just give an example, because even the definition might sound kind of strange to some people, right? So for example, potentially my hand is to the right. Now actually my hand is to the right. Potentially Thomas Apologia has stopped speaking, and now actually Thomas Apologia has stopped speaking, right? And here are the other definitions. So another one is potency. What is potency? Well, potency is just going to be the capacity of any sort, or the capacity of a being or in a being to be, to act, or to receive. So, for example, again, my hand has the capacity to be actually to the right. Now it's actually to the right. But at this stage, it just has the capacity to be to the right.
I get it!
And then, of course, we have passive potency. So this is the principle which receives change from another in as much as it is another being. It is the capacity to receive, to be acted on, or to be modified. Okay, so now that we've gotten some of these definitions out of the way, why don't we actually go to the argument? So here's what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to read a syllogized form of the argument that was given, and then I'm actually going to give justifications for the premises, and then we are going to run over a few objections to this argument and give some answers to those objections. So, premise one is going to be, God is powerful either by virtue of his essence or by virtue of his attribute of power. Now don't worry, I'm going to explain all of these premises in a bit. Premise two is going to be, if God's power is due to his attribute of power, then his essence is not powerful, but is powerful from the attribute of power. Premise 3 is going to be, anything that receives power from another is in a state of potentiality. Premise 4, if God's essence receives power from his attribute, then his essence is in a state of potentiality, and his attribute of power is the actualization of the essence, which is in potentiality. Conclusion. Therefore, if God's power is due to his attribute of power, then God's essence has passive potency. Premise 5. However, it is impossible for God's essence to have passive potency, since passive potency implies imperfection. Conclusion 2. Therefore, God's power must be due to his essence, and consequently, his essence and attributes are identical. Let's go over the justifications for these premises. Now, premise 1 is sort of a true dichotomy, which is just to say that God is either powerful according to his essence or according to his attribute of power, which would mean that the power is going to be identical to God's essence if he is powerful in virtue of his essence, or he has this power in virtue of his attribute of power. So the essence would be powerful according to the attribute of power, because his essence isn't identical to power itself, but rather he has this omnipotence, or this power attribute that he has, right, which is really distinct from his essence. And this would establish that the power that God has is really distinct from his essence. So that's just premise one, not a very controversial premise at all. It's more just truly dichotomous. Now, premise two is that if God's power is not identical to the divine essence, then God is not going to be powerful because of his divine essence, right? And this is obviously true because the essence wouldn't be powerful in this example, right? What would be powerful is the attribute of power. And you could say the essence is powerful in virtue of that attribute, but it's not powerful in and of itself being identical to some power. Then we move on to premise three. This is where it gets a bit more controversial and where we'll provide a bit more backing in the justification of the premise. So premise three is just that this would take into account the act and potency distinction, which I'm going to further defend in the responses to the premises. And we would use this to establish change in the world, and this applies here that if X actualizes Y, then Y is in a state of potency. So for example, if we have wood and fire, then the fire would actualize the wood to make the wood hot. So for this premise, it would just come under this principle that if X makes Y powerful, then Y would be in a state of potency. So consider, for example, as we said before, if fire makes wood powerful, or if fire makes wood burn, then wood is in a state of potency. Or consider if electricity makes a washing machine powerful, or a machine powerful, then the machine itself is in some state of potency. We can then compare this to God, right? If omnipotence makes God powerful, then God is in a state of potency. Okay, so that would be premise three. But then premise four is just that the fourth premises just hinges on the back of the third premise, which is that the idea of the act and potency distinction is that if God is powerful according to his attribute of power, then the attribute of power actualizes his essence, which means that the essence is in a state of potency to act, and the essence is in potentiality, which is passive potency, i.e. this is the ability or the capacity for the essence to receive this power from the attribute of power, which is going to be highly problematic when we draw out the properties that a thing is going to have if it can have passive potency in itself, right? Moving on to premise five then. Premise five is just that it's impossible for God to have passive potency, and this is because passive potency is an unrealized potential, right? So it's in a state of potential rather than perfection, and this would indicate that it has a lack of actualization and is impure. I can't say that God is impure because he is the most perfect being. He can't lack a perfection. But this would be kind of like saying that God's essence is lacking a perfection. So consider that if X has a potency for Y, then X is imperfect, or it lacks this perfection. An example of this could be if a mind with the potency to acquire knowledge is imperfect, insofar as there is some further perfection that it has the capacity to receive. And with God, this would be that God with the potency for power, his essence would be imperfect insofar as it lacks this actualization, or it lacks this perfection in itself. So what are some of the objections to this argument? Well, the first objection is that people will deny the act-potency distinction for metaphysics, Aristotle's act-potency distinction, which I defined earlier on in the video and is fundamental to describing how this argument works. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with the denial of act-potency in this argument as an objection, what one could say is that if one wants to accept that God creates ex nihilo, then we can have a pretty good argument for the act-potency distinction, based on the active potency of God's creation. Now, Ed Fazer, I believe, has a good article on this that you guys can read if you would like to. But here's just like a very short rendition that I'm going to give you guys. It's not going to be too detailed, so don't take this like too incredibly seriously. You could say premise 1, if creation is ex nihilo, either being comes from non-being or being comes from active potency. Premise 2, being can't come from non-being. Conclusion, therefore, finite being at least, comes from active potency. Premise 3, if active potency exists, then there's a real distinction between act and potency. Conclusion, therefore, there is a real distinction between act and potency. Now, going over premise 1, which is going to be the controversial premise, why would this be like a dichotomy? Well, usually other ways of describing change is going to describe the reshaping of pre-existing matter, but that's not what's at play here. So what we're going to basically say is that if someone wants to give a different account of change, they're going to have to offer another account of change which can't, at least linguistically or conceptually, also boil down to act and potency. So consider if someone wants to just say change is when something goes from time 1 to time 2 or something like that, right? Well, does it have the capacity to be at time 2? Does it have the capacity not to be at time 2? And then is it actually at time 2 later? Well, then you can essentially boil down these other theories of change to be ideas of act and potency, right? Now, a further objection that comes to this argument is some people will try to say, well, God can't have active potency because that's a kind of potency and God is pure act, as you've said, right? So you'd be defeating your own argument here. Well, consider this quote from Edward Fazer on describing active potency in his book Scholastic Metaphysics. Fazer writes, quote, "For the moment, let us note that for the scholastics, active potency, strictly speaking, is a kind of act or actuality. It is a kind of act relative to the substance possessing it, though a kind of potency relative to the action it grounds. By potency, what is usually meant is passive potency." And then another interesting objection is some people will say that if anything that receives power is in a state of passive potency, then it would seem that when the Son proceeds from the Father, if the Son receives power or the divine essence from the Father in his procession, then this would seem to say that the Son is in potency, and thus there is potency in God, and then thus the argument also works against a Trinitarian, right? Wouldn't this argument also debunk the Trinity, as well as debunking Islamic tawhid? Well, I have a few things to say about this. One is that passive potency is a capacity to receive or to be changed, but the Son's reception in his procession isn't a type of capacity or a type of potency at all, because it's something necessary. The Son necessarily must proceed from the Father. There is no possible world in which this does not happen. Across all possible worlds, God is Trinitarian. So it's not going to imply some potency. And further, in this argument, the essence of God does not need to necessarily always actualize his attribute of power. And thus, the essence being made powerful by this attribute is a type of capacity. So, for example, God does not always have to use his attributes. It's possible that God could use his power to do something else. It's possible that he could have not done something. Yet, having the capacity to do these things demonstrates that the essence has a capacity for the reception of this power. Unless you have a pretty neat argument there to show that if God's attribute of power is really distinct from his essence, then God is in a state of passive potency. But passive potency implies imperfection, and God is perfect, so therefore God's essence could not be really distinct from his attribute of power. However, if God's attributes are identical to his essence, then divine simplicity is true, and at least this understanding of tawhid here is false. So let me know what you guys think in the video. I think there's definitely some further development that could be done to this argument. I'd also like to shout out, I believe, Astro for developing this argument. I believe that is where I have received this from. People have sent me this argument a few times, I've wrote in my notes a couple things that I've thought on it, and I thought that I'd make a video for you guys in helping the development of this argument. But with that being said, God bless you all.